Hello, Acacia. We're going to take a look at your rhythm and repetition and notan posting. Give a little bit of observational feedback on those two. So let's go ahead and get into screen sharing here, and we'll get right to it. Okay, so here we are. This is the repetition and rhythm. Of course, we had the three types of rhythm as I did describe in the overview video. It looks like we have good. Basically going through, looking at the overall structure, meaning did you post everything that we needed to be posted? Did you identify things the way they needed to be identified, so on and so forth? Another thing that we want to be looking at is things like whether you expose things properly, whether the photograph looks well exposed, although we're not focusing a whole lot on camera control here. We do want to be mindful of the settings so that we aren't getting images that are out of out of the range, or too bright or too dark and things like that. So it looks like you're in pretty good hands there as well. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. When you're starting off right here in this progressive image, you're calling it progression, and that's cool. This is a very good example of a progressive rhythm. It's a little bit one note in terms of all it is the rhythm itself. It's not really a rhythm leading us anywhere, but that's fine. We're just really concentrating on identifying what it is so that you begin to recognize it and know how to use it in the composition. So here's a beautifully atmospheric. You can see how it's creating that atmospheric depth because of the sort of leading nature of a progressive repetitive element. Also, you're using a very shallow depth of field. What this means is you're most likely having your aperture very wide open. In other words, the number that represents the size of the hole is very close to 1. So it would be something like 2, 2.8, or 3.5, or 4. 1 would mean that the size of the hole is equal to the size of the lens. 2 would mean that the size of the hole is half the size of the lens. So if the lens is this big and the hole is half the size, it's like this. So that would be an aperture of 2. So anyway, the smaller that hole is, the greater the depth of field, meaning more focus. The bigger the hole is, the less. So this has very shallow depth of field, means you would have an f-stop that is very shallow. Here it's different. You have a greater depth of field here, meaning you can see farther back. It's still not infinite. You can see the back of the boat isn't quite there. Now, again, this is a little bit one note. We're just kind of looking at that. You're getting it right, but we're not quite using it in the composition yet. And that'll be the next step as you continue to use these kinds of strategies. We move from these kinds of exercises where we just want you to identify them, which you're doing perfectly, to the idea that you'd be incorporating them in an overall composition. In other words, using that repetition, but it's not the only thing going on in the composition itself. Now we have the alternating rhythm, and what you're doing here is interesting because there's a combination happening here, because we do have these leading lines here, which are reminiscent of the sort of progressive rhythm, but they're not exactly creating that. I see your alternating rhythm that's going on here, 1, 2, 1, 2. So that's making sense. So it's clear you understand the concept of that rhythm. You've also got an undulating rhythm going on in the grain of the wood. And I'm pointing this out because a lot of times you're going to be looking at a scene and you'll see multiple opportunities to highlight a certain type of rhythm, highlight a certain type of repetition, and you're going to want to choose which one to emphasize. And that is where you come in. Photography is not just observational. We do a lot of observation, but the photographer, as a photographer, you're going to make choices about what things you want to bring about. What kind of things are you interested in focusing on? I was about to say no pun intended, but whatever. Anyway, here you're identifying an undulating rhythm. And I would say you're perhaps on there. This is getting to be more, I would say, like a dissonant rhythm. I mentioned that a little bit in class. We're not using that as a focus here, but I would say you're on the border of an undulating rhythm. I mean, there's certainly certain things that are undulating about it. Undulating rhythm is going to be a combination of an identifiable repeating element or an identifiable progressive element. This really is a little bit different than that. It's getting close to maybe an identifiable repeating element. But really what we have is we have a pattern or a repetition happening, not a pattern. We have a repetition happening, but there's very little pattern or form to it. In other words, it's hard to identify a kind of where is the next logical stick supposed to appear. When we see something like this, we call that a dissonant rhythm, meaning that there's definitely a rhythm happening, but there's no pattern to it or predictable pattern to it. It's a good thing to use when we want to be able to use it. This is a much different type of undulating rhythm, which is embedded inside of your progressive rhythm. This being the progressive rhythm, which is kind of fanning out. These circles are getting larger and larger and larger, so that's progressive. But then you have these lines in between there, which are somewhat of an undulating nature. So you're kind of going back and forth here, experimenting, which is all healthy. If I were to say anything to improve on what you're doing here, it would be to kind of look more in terms of using those strategies in the composition rather than just identifying them by themselves as we move forward. Like I said, these projects that we're doing, I really want you to focus on what we're doing in that particular experiment. But the idea is once we move through that, we want you to be able to incorporate those things. And then we moved on to this, the Notan exercise. This is where we're sort of thinking about a subject a little bit. So we've been working with form, we've been working with rhythm and the kind of intent to move the viewer's eye through. Now we're looking at subject and how subject can affect the composition, how subject can affect form. Subject being, in this case, the effects of objects on light, and then the absence of light, which is the shadows forming what we would call negative space or emptiness. So this idea of the emptiness versus the lightness, the object versus the non-object, the spaces in between, all of that has to do with this balance between those two elements. So we're talking about Notan here. So here is what your solutions are, and I would say these are much more in terms of overall composition of some of the identifiable patterns and things that are going on. This is what I'm talking about more so, where you're using a rhythm within a composition. Here, where you're using these shadows, which is all very good. We're exploring the use of these, but then it's a repeating element, a progressive rhythm that you've got going on here, but it's not the only thing going on. You've got the idea that this is a pattern of light as well. You've got the idea that these are identifiable objects, subjects, so on and so forth. So it's not just reading as an image of a pattern. It's reading more like you're interpreting something, or at least getting toward interpreting something, which is really where we want to start to be. Here again, you'll see how it's transformed. You're using that dissonant rhythm again, similar to the tree that you were using in the last experiment, but see how it's transformed. See how it becomes something sort of different, something more actually, because now you have this multiple layer. You have the tree still there, all of the benefit of that pattern and rhythm, but it's overlaid on top of this other stuff, which then kind of gives you this dimension to something that's very simple. But then we have these interactions here with the shadow and the object over the top of it. There's a lot of possibilities here that we don't want to overlook. And this is what's great about photography, is something as simple as training our perspective onto something and transform it completely. These, flowers, the difference between making a photograph of these flowers and then portraying them on this sort of bent steel, whatever this happens to be, completely different interpretation. This is getting more toward what you have to say about them rather than just what they look like. Is this the end? Of course not. But this is leading you toward the idea of, this is important. This is what I want to communicate. I would say that this area right in here, composition-wise, is not necessary. If we were to just have the what's important to you, which would be probably this area right in here, that's probably the best sort of spot for you. Here we're incorporating the shadow with the element, and I think of these, this is where you're getting kind of to the heart of it. Here you're sort of starting, right? This may have been an earlier image that you were working out. It still reads as a bowl with a, with a sort of, oh yeah, and there's a shadow. Here you're getting to maybe a little bit closer where the flowers and the shadow are starting to maybe equal each other. But by the time you got to here, you sort of found yourself like, oh, now I get it. Now I know how to use the dark versus the light, the spaces in between them, so on and so forth, in order to create this rhythmic balance, so that by the time you get to something like this, where you have a lot of shadow going on and a lot of highlights happening and it's interacting, you've got this sort of dissonant rhythm again that's happening, you've really kind of, hit it on all. That's the progression of a photograph. When you're exploring an idea, you may start off with something simple like this, and then progress yourself through that exploration until you get to something that's maybe more closely aligned with what you're trying to communicate, or what's more closely aligned to your own vision. There's really no way to skip all of that. You have to shoot through all of the initial stuff first before you get to the other. So I'm seeing a lot of really good good work here. The possibilities of what you're doing are really encouraging. I'm really interested in your the way you're handling the overall space, the overall compositions in your photography. Like I mentioned earlier, I think from the next step forward for you is definitely going to be to start to think about these principles and how you can incorporate them into effective and dynamic compositions, so that you're moving away from the technical exercise and getting more into an aesthetic exercise where you're expressing things that are important to you. So that's what I have for you, and I'll be happy to answer more questions if you have them. So just let me know and we'll set something up. All right, we'll see you in the studio. Bye now.